Welcome to my standard review. Every week I like to go over the top performing decks in the meta, both for best of 3 and best of 1. And every once in a while I like to start things off with a budget deck if available. This week there was no budget deck that caught my interest, but we did see some interesting decks, especially for Rakdos and for Golgari. So this week we're going to start things off with the Rakdos Midrange deck by Jub77. And if I compare this to the list that I covered for the Rakdos Midrange deck in week 4 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we can see that there's been quite a few changes. This is running, we've got 3 copies of Liliana the Veil in the main, 4 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat, which has been a very impressive card from Lost Caverns, being able to remove your opponent's interaction from their hand, and then they have to use interaction to get the interaction back. Means that they have to use interaction to kill a 2-drop 1/1 flyer, and that's always good. So this has been I've been seeing this in more and more lists, so you should definitely consider including it. Took the copies of Tenacious Underdog down from 4 to only 1 copy, which I think is good because the Blitz, being able to blitz this later is kind of a finisher against control, and it just is. It hasn't been coming up as often as it used to. And then we've got 4 copies of the Preacher of the Schism, which is a really nice mid-range threat. It allows, every time that you attack, you get to draw a card and lose 1 life. If you have more life than your opponent, or you get to create a 1/1 vampire creature token with lifelink. And if they're above your life total, and if you're tied, it does both. And you also, as a 2/4 Death Toucher, is also just a nice defensive card. And we've got the 2 copies of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, which I think works really nicely with the Deep Cavern Bat. You do get a 1/1 flying, the evasiveness you can get in with the Gix, and then draw additional cards to help you find more threats. We got no copies of the Graveyard Trespasser, and which was kind of a staple card for a long time. So there's not as much need for Graveyard Hate. And so we're checking out Geological Appraiser, 4 copies, and this one helps you find additional threats. So a lot of times this is just 2 cards in 1, and as long as you're hitting this side of your curve, right? And I've been impressed with this one in limited as well. Curious to see if it's powerful enough for for standard instead of just limited. But 2 cards in 1 is always good, right? So happy to see this one. And we've got 2 copies of Bonehorde Dracosaur, which has been one of the top performing mythics from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. A 5/5 flying first striker for 5 that digs for additional cards, and then you can play those cards, and you also create 3/1 dinosaurs and treasure tokens depending on what you flip over. And so this has been an amazing threat. And we're cutting the Archfiends of the Dross, taking the cut downs from 4 down to 2, and upping the amount of Go for the Throats from 2 to 4. Adding 1 Infernal Grasp, just for some artifact-specific hate. We're seeing more schooners and such, so this one's good for getting rid of those blue schooners. And then we're getting rid of. There's no copy of the Molten Collapse, which was the black-red destroy target sorcery, I think, from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. No Shieldred's Edicts. Cutting the 2 copies of the Shieldred's Edicts, no Urabrask's Forge, and no Obnixilis the Adversary, which that was covered in the week 4 one because as a way to kind of take the old shell and then make it faster. So I think this one's leaning a little bit more into the flying threats to finish off your opponent. And then we've got 1 copy of Virtue of Persistence for, not only is it good at early removal by giving something -3/-3 and then gaining 2 life, but then you get to cycle back your broken threats, right? And so this was a mythic list in best of 3. So we'll go over the sideboard as well. So we got 2 copies of the 2 more copies of Cutdown in case you're up against aggro and cheap drops. Got 2 copies of Anoint with Affliction, which is particularly nice if you come up against the Golgari Midrange, being able to exile the Dreadmoss so that it doesn't just keep returning as a recurring threat is very nice. Infernal Grasp, in case you come up against more artifact specific. We've seen like Azorius artifacts starting to be a more popular pick, and so you can sub these in for your go for the throats if you're in that matchup. Sorin the Mirthless, as well as Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, are both just for punishing your opponent if they don't have enough interaction or if you need additional mid-range threats. Sorin the Mirthless is particularly nice against aggro because of being able to bring in a 2/3 lifelinker. Makes it very difficult for your opponent to race. And Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal is just a recurring threat. As long as your opponent has no cards in hand or you don't have any cards in hand, you can just keep transforming it back into a 4/4 flying lifelink. So both of these, nice mid-range, both have lifelink. So, and then we've got Duress if you're up against the control matchup. Unlicensed Hearse, if you do need a little bit of that graveyard hate, Unlicensed Hearse is one of the classic sideboard cards for attacking your opponent's graveyard. We've got Phyrexian Arena if you need to outvalue your other mid-range opponent or control player and try to if they're not pressuring your life total, this is a good way to get enough card advantage. And then we've got Brotherhood's End as the Wrath choice if you are playing against a go wide strategy. Next up, we have the Golgari Midrange deck by Tizio that won first place on December 9th in the Standard Challenge on Moto. And if we compare this to the Golgari Midrange that I covered in week 10 of Wilds of Eldraine, the very end, see a couple of changes. So Liliana's not in the main, taking out 2 copies of the Liliana the Veil, and we're down to 1 copy of Nissa Ascended Animist, so less Planeswalker specific stuff. We do see the 4 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat, down the 1 copy of the Tenacious Underdog, and down 2 copies of the Tranquil Frillback instead of just running 1. And this one is nice for the artifact and enchantment specific hate, so I imagine there's more copies of this in the sideboard. And but we're seeing Sentinel of the Nameless City as just a one of, and as well as 1 copy of Preacher of the Schism and 1 copy of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor. I do think that this works really well with the bat, like I just mentioned, for the other deck. And so right now, Golgari Midrange seems like it's in this spot where people are trying to figure out what the best combo is, and it isn't quite figured out, right? Like if we compare, there are multiple lists in Golgari Midrange this week that are all doing different things. So I think that like keeping 1 copy of these cards is trying to kind of like figure out, explore the space a little bit. And then we've got no copies of the Graveyard Trespasser. Sorry. Actually, I'm not sure the Graveyard... Pardon me. Graveyard Trespasser was not being run in this list. We've got no copies of Lord Skitter, the Sewer King, and no copies of the Blossoming Tortoise. Blossoming Tortoise was the one that was being explored in the mid-range space during the Lost Caverns of... during Wilds of Eldraine. And we've got 1 more copy of Sheoldred the Apocalypse in the main, 1 less copy of Cut Down, 2 copies of Dig Up for a specific tutor, which I thought was kind of fun to see, 1 Gix's Command for a Wrath. We've got Terra Sunder as a 1 copy of as well, 1 copy of the Celestis, keeping the Iron Crag for a little bit of ramp, including 1 copy of the Cruelty of Gix for a little bit of reanimation. I think was kind of interesting. And then 1 copy of the Virtue of Persistence, which we've seen kind of come and go throughout the weeks. And as far as the lands go, we're down to 25 from 26, and no copies of the Mishra's Foundry. For the sideboard, we've got a copy of Cut Down, Anoint with Affliction, Tear Asunder, the Graveyard Trespasser, Liliana of the Veil, Tranquil Frillback, the End. If you are coming up against like Azorius Control, this is a particularly nice one if they have a limited amount of threats. Sometimes removing the Wandering Emperor is like the only way that your opponent can actually like reliably win the game, right? Duress against the control players, Pilfer. You choose a non-land, that target player discards that card. This one's kind of an interesting one to see over like a duress. Hits creatures specifically, so interesting choice here instead of the 3 copies of duress. Path of Peril for Wrath if you're up against the go wide strategies. Phyrexian Arena if you need to get some more additional card advantage and your life total isn't being pressured. Gix's Command as another excellent Wrath or way to get lifelink. And then 1 copy of Breach the Multiverse, or if you're coming up against... I hate how sometimes you can't see it. Sorry, guys, but Breach the Multiverse is really nice if you're looking for an alternate win condition. Or if you're playing up against the Atraxa decks, right? Like Domain, you can just steal their Atraxas. So this week we got 2 Golgari Midrange. So second place on December 9th was taken down by Somba Galade. Sorry if I massacred your name. But this one, if we compare it to the Golgari Midrange, the same, week 10 Wilds of Eldraine, you can see that they went in a different direction, and but we still have some similarities. Like we've got 4 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat, but we've got 4 copies instead of just 1 of the Sentinel of the Nameless City, 2 copies of the Preacher of the Schism. No, they also agreed to cut the 1 copy of the Tenacious Underdog, as well as the 2 copies of Lord Skitter. They took all of the copies of the Tranquil Frillback out of the main, all the copies of Shieldred the Apocalypse out of the main. They are running the Blossoming Tortoise, and we've got -1 cut down, -1 go for the throat, and upping 1 Anoint with Affliction in the main, as well as 1 copy of Shieldred's Edict. And no Iron Crag, getting rid of the kind of ramp aspect of it, as well as no copies of Duress. So both the last list I just covered and the previous one were... The list I just covered and the previous one from week 10 of Wilds of Eldraine were both running Duress in the main, which I thought was interesting, because sometimes Duress is just a complete whiff, right? Especially in Best of 1, where you have a lot of creature-specific, like creature-only decks with mono-white humans and whatnot. But this is for Best of 3, and so they've moved the Duresses to the sideboard. They did include 1 copy of Gix's Command, as well as 2 copies of the Virtue of Persistence. So you can kind of compare the 2 lists and see the similarities. This one was still running the 2 copies of the Mishra's Foundry that we saw in week 10, and it's definitely a space to explore. And the fact that both of these lists got number 1 and number 2 on the standard challenge means that like Golgari is well positioned. We started to see more mono red, and I think that this deck does do better against like the mono red decks than it does against like a really heavy control meta. So we'll see if this starts to, like, if next week we're going to see more like Azorius control or Esper control kind of come in to counteract the amount of Golgari decks that are showing up. But, the rock paper scissors is best of 3. And in the sideboard, though, we've got Terra Sunder, Liliana of the Veil, the Tranquil Frillbacks. If you're coming up against like the Esper midrange, being able to destroy the Wedding Announcement or the Virtue of Loyalty. We've got Shieldred the Apocalypse, 3 copies. And I'm always wondering, like, why do some people decide to run Shelly in the main? Why do some decide to put it in the sideboard? And Shelly has a lot of, there's a lot of cards out there that are specifically waiting to kill Shieldred, right? Like, go for the throat. You usually hold for your opponent's Shieldred. So it might be that if you don't see a lot of interaction from your opponent, that you can bring Shieldred back in, or if you're up against, like, red tends to struggle with the 5 toughness, for example. We've got the copies of Duress that you can bring in against control. Pithing Needle, it was fun to see this one. Pithing Needle is kind of like the end. It's an alternative way to just kind of destroy a strategy that has one specific card that they're relying on heavily. So being able to choose Wandering Emperor, for example, makes it so that they can't use the Wandering Emperor's activated Planeswalker abilities. You've got Terra Sunder, Path of Peril, and a Phyrexian Arena. So on December 10th, first place was taken down by a domain ramp list by Ruby Exilia. And if we compare the list to week 3 for Lost Caverns of Ixalan, it is the same exact list. so I'm not going to be covering it this week. But second place was brought down by Rakdos Breach, which is a new one that we've seen some content creators playing around with, and then also seeing it here in the tournament proves that like it can do the thing. And so this one is by Ivan Drago, and it looks more similar to, or it plays out more similar to the domain strategy, where you're basically trying to ramp and then play wraths. So you've got like you've got interaction to slow your opponent down. So you've got like Virtue of Persistence. You've got Go for the Throat. You've got the Wraths with Brotherhood's End, as well as Burn Down the House. And then you've got the Celestis and Ironcrag to kind of help you ramp to your big threats, as well as Big Score. So playing Big Score on 4 or 3, if you ramp to it, you can cheat out these expensive cards very quickly, and also use this to help find those expensive cards. And then we're not doing like a Reanimator package though with Big Score, because that's another one that it was used for, is like get Atraxa into your graveyard and then reanimate it with Gix's command or whatever, right? But in this one, we're just using that to ramp into our big threats. And so we've got several big threats. We've got Atali, Primal Conqueror. We've got the Archfiend of the... Wait, no? We've got Chandra, Hope's Beacon. Sorry, I thought for some reason the Archfiend of the Dross was in here. It might be in the sideboard. Chandra's Hope's Beacon, and then really the big thing though, the big whammy, right, is Breach the Multiverse. And being able to breach the multiverse into Atali, sometimes you can loop into another Breach the Multiverse, and it's just like absolutely disgusting, right? And but it is a best of 3 list, and we've got Cut Downs, Graveyard Trespassers, Shieldred, Duress. So yeah, I don't know why I thought Dross was in this list. My bad. 4 copies of Duress, and then 4 copies of Lithomanic Barrage. So just very, very like focused, specific hate against certain decks and certain strategies. Oh, look at that. There it is. It wasn't here. Okay, I'm not crazy. Yeah, so it's running 4 copies of the Archfiend of the Dross, which is another thing that you can cheat out. And some of the decks are like you can use your so some of the decks are running the Archfiend of the Dross and then sacrificing it, and then you can like bring it back with the Virtue of Persistence. This one isn't doing that specifically, but I mean you can always shoot your own. Right, you can always shoot up your own Archfiend of the Dross if you're going to lose with like a Go for the Throat. Anyway, all right, and then third place, because I'm not going to cover the domain ramp list. It seemed fair to cover what is happening with Azorius Soldiers right now, and this one was a list that got third place on December 10th by Victor Carvalho 01. And if we compare this to the list that I covered in week 2 of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, there's a few changes, nothing too crazy. We're down 1 copy of Harbin, which, it's hard to say that this is even Azorius Soldiers at this point, because, we've decreased so many soldiers from the actual list that it might be better to call this just Azorius Flash. But because of that, Harbin has less synergies to actually be a win condition. But with enough of the loops with like Zephyr Sentinel to replay your Knight Errants, Resolute Reinforcements, like it still works as a win condition. But I'm not surprised to see this number drop a little bit. We've got 2 copies of the Werefox Bodyguard for some specific removal, as well as you can sacrifice it to gain life, and you can use it to protect your important pieces, right? Which is kind of what's cool about it over, say, Cathar. And then we've got no copies of the Virtue of Loyalty, no copies of the Cavern of Souls. We were seeing the Cavern of Souls momentarily, but like I said, because there's so many, it's not strictly a tribal deck. So they've removed the 2 copies of the Cavern of Souls, and in place of it, they've gone up 1 copy of the Darker Wastes, the Painland, and then 1 more copy of the Deserted Beach. And for the sideboard, we've got 3 copies of Lantern Flare, which can be really nice for gaining some life if you're in a race. Wandering Emperor, which can be a really good card to bring in, both against like red when you need to gain some more life and remove some of your opponent's threats, but also good against control, because a lot of the wraths specifically affect the board but don't attack the planeswalkers. So that's why Wandering Emperor is such a nice sideboard card, is that you can bring it in several matchups. Overcharged Amalgam, which was a fun one. I haven't seen this one in a sideboard. You get a 3/3 flash flyer with exploit, and when you exploit a creature, you sacrifice a creature and you counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. So I think this one will definitely catch people off guard. 2 copies of Destroy Evil. If you're coming up against like the enchantment heavy decks, 2 copies of Get Lost, which also gives you kind of enchantment hate, but also specifically creature hate that doesn't have to have toughness 4 or greater. Lantern Flares for against aggro, and Tokashia's Welcome for the if you need to outvalue your opponent. And now for the best of 1 segment, and this week mono red aggro was the number 1, and it was the same list as the list that I covered in week 4 of mono red. As week 4 of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. I should have had more coffee before I did this episode. And but number 2 was mono white humans, and if we compare this to the list I covered in week 2, we see some changes, and we're down to 1 copy of Hopeful Initiate, which is something that we saw at the end of Wilds of Eldraine, was dropping the Hopeful Initiate down to 1 copy. And this is nice against the Celestia Enchantments deck, right? Like it depends on how much artifact and enchantment hate you're coming up against, but it is kind of weak against the like mono red aggro, right? I mean, it depends on, it's a little bit matchup dependent. So dropping this one down to 1 and bringing in the Lunarch Veteran is like, how can we make this deck better against the amount of mono red in best of 1 aggro, right? Or in the best of 1 meta. And then we've got no copies of the Warden of the Inner Sky, which I'm not surprised to see. Like, we were trying it out, and it was kind of like a go tall instead of the go wide strategy that mono white usually is. And the Scry was kind of helpful, but like a lot of times you couldn't really afford to be tapping your stuff, specifically against like the early pressure of like mono red. So no copies of the Warden of the Inner Sky, and instead we've got 3 copies of Skrelv, which helps protect our Thalia and our Coppercoat Vanguard and the early targeted single point removal interaction from our opponents that they have to shoot Skrelv instead, right? Then we've got 4 copies of the Intrepid Adversary, which the lifelink is really helpful against mono red, and 2 copies of Spellbook Vendor. So basically what we're seeing is like the build that was at the end of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan week 10, or sorry, Wilds of Eldraine week 10, and but we're bringing in the lands that we got from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. So no Sanguine Evangelist, no copies of Ossification, and 22 lands down from 23, only 1 copy of Agonjo, Seat of the Empire, and down 2 copies of the Mishra's Foundry to just 1, but 4, including 4 copies of the Cavern of Souls. So then going down the list, we've got a different version of mono white humans at number 3, which is the same as the week 2 list, except for they are including the 4 Cavern of Souls and going down to 1 Agonjo. And then we got a mono red burn is at number 4, which is the list that I covered in week 3. Celestia Enchantments is number 5, which is the list that I covered in week 2. Celestia Enchantments is number 6, and it's the same one, but you have -4 Brushland for 2 forests and 2 plains. And but then we get down to the Boros Tokens list, and some people have been calling this Boros Aggro, but this one's number 7. And if we compare this to the Boros Tokens that I covered in week 5 of Wilds of Eldraine, you can see they brought in some new cards like the Warden of the Inner Sky from the Lost Caverns, ditching the 3 copies of Skrelv, dropping the Charming Scoundrels down to 2, and adding 4 copies of the Sanguine Evangelist, and getting rid of the Raging Battle Mouse, which was the card that made your second spell cost 1 less, and yeah, and then running 22 lands instead of 21, up 4 copies of the Sundown Pass, as well as 1 inclusion of the Thran Portal. during the Gruul aggro combat tricks that I just ran. I do think that this is an okay card, right? I mean, a lot of people don't like it because it is just like always going to hurt you. And it's a lot of text to figure out what it actually does, but like it's basically a pain land, right? And this deck is incredibly fast, so even against mono red, I don't think it's that punishing to have a couple copies of the Thran Portal. So I kind of want to see this card being used more, right? And I showcased it back in the early part of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, where, during the early parts of the Wilds of Eldraine, running a deck that had like aimed to get a turn 3 win in Izzet. And basically it was a mono red list running the Scalding Viper, right? And you know, I think there are some lists that can play the Thran Portal without being punished, and I think like the Gruul aggro deck is one of them. So anyway, enough of that rant. And then as we go down the list, we've got some more mono white humans. Number 8 was the same list as the one that I covered way back in like Lord of the Rings. It has not changed for months and is still a top performing deck in best of 1. Mono red burn was number 9, and it's the same as week 3 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, except for it's down 1 squee for a Chandra, Dress to Kill. And number 10 was Domain Ramp, which was very similar to the one that I covered in week 3, except for it was up 1 Courier's Briefcase, down 1 Go for the Throat, up 1 Invasion of Zendikar to a total of 3, and then down 1 Mountain for a total of 25 lands from 26. And like, you know, Domain Ramp is like is a better deck in best of 3 in my opinion. But it's basically just how do you make it perform better against mono red. And then the Gruul aggro list that I covered yesterday was number 13, except for it was down. It's the one that's running 1 less Iconoclast and 3 less Rockfall Veils for 4 more copies of Thran Portal. And I have to agree with that. Like, after playing the deck, I was just like, let's just play the Thran Portals, because the Rockfall Veils are so frustrating in those turn 1 and turn 2. But to end this rampage of mine, the last list is a fun one. It's number 18th on the list, and you know, like, all of these you can hit Mythic with. It just depends on how much time, right, you're going to spend on it. And Izzet Pirates was something that we covered, that I covered for best of 3 in week 4 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And so there's been a couple of changes, down to 3 copies of Captain Storm Cosmium Raider, down from 4. Only 2 copies of the Roaming Throne, and I think that this card is honestly one that, like, we were I was thinking about including it in the Boros aggro list or the Boros human list. Some of them were running the Roaming Throne to get additional triggers, and I think a lot of times it's just slower than people anticipate. And like, once you got this thing rolling and you're getting all of your triggers anyway, I think this could just be an additional like icing on top, right? So I'm happy to see this down 2 copies, and I think it might even be worth cutting entirely, right? But I don't know, I haven't played the deck yet. Voltage Surge, we've got 4 copies of, which was in the sideboard. They're bringing it here into the main, which makes sense in best of 1. You just got you want as much early interaction as you can get. Down 2 copies of Spell Pierce, because on the flip side of things, you're less likely to come up against control. You've got the Witch Stalkers, -2 on the Witch Stalkers Frenzy, but for 2 copies of Sticky Fingers, which I think is a fun one. It gives your creature menace for being able to push your damage through, and then whenever you deal damage to a player, you create a treasure token, which then helps trigger all of your stuff that triggers on artifact ETBs. And then when it dies, it draws a card. Excuse me. And then when the creature dies, it draws a card. And so this one I thought was a fun inclusion. I'm really curious to see how it performs. 23 lands instead of 22, which usually you don't see land count go up when you're converting things to best of 1. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And but we've got 2 Cavern of Souls compared to the best of 3 list, and up 2 Secluded Courtyards, which everything in the deck is pirate except for like Roaming Throne. So I'm guessing this is why they've increased the total land count, is because like this does miss on, you know, it is just a colorless land on some of these cards. Yeah, and then we're not running any copies of Mirix. I think that's just because the amount of times where does the deck actually win ever through Mirix, even if you are up against Control, right? So remember to hit like and subscribe if you like these meta reviews. I do one every Sunday. If you think I'm missing something, I'm always welcome to, like, hey, you didn't talk about this archetype. I think you should cover this one, that sort of thing. I love hearing back from you guys, and I'll be back next week to cover do a 50 matches showcase for a deck that wins the vote on YouTube, and then I'll be covering more of these stuff. So good luck on your games, good luck on the ladder, and take care, everybody.